In 1965, a series of actions known as the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley were hailed in Saigon and Washington as the first major American triumph of the war. The helicopter played a central role in these actions, validating the effectiveness of air mobility in the war in Vietnam. The 1st Air Cavalry Division, also known as the CAV, arrived in Vietnam in mid-September of 1965. The division was confident and led by officers and NCOs who were strong believers in the effectiveness of air mobility.
The Air Mobile Division that goes over there is probably one of the best units that the U.S. has ever seen up to that time. Yeah, these are people who have been in the military for a long time. They're well-trained, committed, and they believe in the objective, hold the line against communism.
The cavalry division's men and helicopters were assigned to an old French airstrip near An Cay. There they rapidly established a base camp from which to operate. The CAV would not have long to wait for its baptism of fire. The enemy was well established in the mountainous area known as the Central Highlands. On September 18th, a battalion lost 4 helicopters and 3 company commanders when they mistakenly landed in the middle of an enemy bunker complex. Artillery and airstrikes were needed to break enemy resistance. On October 19th, just a month later, the Special Forces camp at Plei Me came under heavy attack. An ARVN force that moved south along the highway from Pleiku to relieve the camp was itself ambushed. 1st Air Cavalry artillery was rapidly airlifted by helicopter into position, and its fire helped enable the ARVN to break through to the camp. For the next 35 days, the helicopters and men of the 1st Cavalry Division fought and pursued portions of 3 North Vietnamese or NVA regiments, using their artillery and aerial firepower to drive them out of the valley and into Cambodia.
Those operations that the CAV was performing in that first year that they were over there did a job on the 3rd NVA Division. The 2nd VC Regiment that was part of the 3rd NVA Division was virtually wiped out.
Despite significant American casualties, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley confirmed to the American command the power of air mobility. It was the first of many battles that would lead to the conflict in Vietnam coming to be known as the Helicopter War. If any one piece of equipment were chosen to symbolize the American war on Vietnam, it would be the UH-1 Belle Iroquois, better known as the Huey, or Slick. Faced with a war that lacked front lines and an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, the American answer was mobility and firepower. Nothing represented mobility better than the Huey.
Transportation now for the troops was by air, and 99% of the time it was by helicopter.
For the veterans, the sound of the helicopter still evokes memories of a now distant war.
I did finally sit through Apocalypse Now all the way from beginning to end, because always in the past, near the beginning of the movie, where an air cavalry unit launches an assault on a Vietnamese village, I'd always walked out of the movie during that, because it was too close to home. It just... And even today, when I hear that music, and as soon as I hear that music start, I can hear the helicopters.
When the first American combat troops splashed ashore in Vietnam in 1965, all this was still in its infancy. The helicopter had been invented before World War II, but it was not until the Korean War that it found a place on the battlefield. In 1956, the Army sought to develop this concept of air mobility.
The air mobile concept, the use of helicopters on a large scale to conduct operations. Now this was conceived, again, as a way to deal with the high technology battlefield of Western Europe. The thought was helicopters would provide you with the maneuverability, the mobility that was required on the nuclear battlefield, where dispersion was seen as being especially important, and also concentration. So helicopters gave you this capability to rapidly disperse and concentrate forces.
However, military spending was focused on nuclear weapons, and money for conventional arms development was in short supply. It was not until President John F. Kennedy took office that the Army undertook extensive experiments with helicopters. Based on an enthusiastic report, the Army created an Air Mobile Division. Men and helicopters from all over the Army were ordered to Fort Benning, Georgia, to form the 11th Air Assault Division. Here, the new tactics were tried out in practice. In Vietnam, the difficult terrain and lack of roads confronted U.S. Army advisors with severe problems. The road-bound ARVN were vulnerable to ambushes, and the helicopters seemed to hold the key to countering guerrilla mobility. The American advisors began using supply helicopters to conduct ad hoc air assaults with ARVN units.
They had a program called Shotgun, and that was where we would send individuals over to fly in the helicopters that were supporting the Vietnamese, and they were door gunners with the helicopters. And at that time there weren't any, the helicopters hadn't really been configured to be a combative aircraft. It was strictly to move troops from one place to another. And the first machine gun was hung from a strap from the ceiling, and it was freewheeling. It was not a very effective system.
These early combat operations showed the vulnerability of the helicopters to ground fire. Each operation seemed to point out another area of air mobility which could be improved upon. Drawing on this combat experience and the extensive field testing done in the United States, the Army developed its air mobile doctrine that became standard in Vietnam.
Some of the tactics we were trained in was what called nap of the earth, flying low, and being able to navigate. We didn't have all this fancy stuff at that time we have now, like the GPS and inertial navigation systems and whatnot. It was strictly eyeball.
The organization grew and added scout helicopters, helicopter gunships for fire support, utility helicopters for assault landings, resupply, and medical evacuations, and heavier helicopters to deliver artillery and other large pieces of equipment to the combat area.
Probably what you would use a truck for, in most cases, they used helicopters for. I mean, the helicopters basically, carried everything from troops to supplies to, bodies back. Some of the missions we called over there was called ash and trash, where it was hauling ashes, victims. We had a regular resupply route. They carried mail back and forth, those kinds of things, as well as troop insertions. We had B-model Hueys that were equipped as gunships. Their job was to suppress an area before we went in with the rest of the flight.
What it did for the CAV is it gave the CAV an opportunity to cover a lot of territory. So it was a force multiplier in that respect. Another thing about the air mobility is it did a lot more for the troops. I think we might have had fewer casualties because we had more choppers to get guys out with.
Given the wide variety of roles helicopters were able to perform in Vietnam, they quickly became essential to U.S. efforts there. With our helicopters, we could run, but when it came to hiding, the enemy was usually the master. So American operations depended on reconnaissance, finding the enemy. The helicopter made its own unique contribution here, the Light Observation Helicopter, or LOACH.
Those guys would fly very, very low, like on the trees, under the trees, just above the trees at some very, very low speeds, okay? 10, sometimes even hovering speeds, 10 miles an hour. So you can see. Now, can somebody hide from that individual? Sure. Those people got very, 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 very skilled at the place where they could follow trails, and so they could cover in 15 minutes sometimes what would take a ground unit maybe even a half a day.
Tolling for Charlie meant that the Loach crew was very vulnerable. To improve their odds when scouts were on the hunt, they were generally supported by gunships.
We were like sitting ducks. We went out to try to draw fire, and we flew at treetop level. And the unit that I was in, we flew two-man in the Loach helicopter. We had a pilot and an observer, and basically we were just out on recon missions. And if we did encounter the enemy, then we always had the firepower that was above us.
Armed helicopter gunships, known as guns or snakes, watched over and attacked anyone or anything found by the Loaches. Early on, these were other light helicopters equipped with rockets.
The difficulty with these early gunships, these first gunships, is that they lack the lift and the power necessary to carry enough armament, ammunition, and armor to make them effective, and their speed is also slow. So generally it's a great concept, but they're pretty ineffective.
In response, the versatile Huey was modified with machine guns and rocket pods.
Those were equipped with two M60s in the doors. Some of them had miniguns mounted on them, and then one M60, and some of them had rocket launchers on them. Those were the ones they affectionately called a hog because they barely stagger off the ground with the rocket pods mounted on them and a couple of machine guns, and then the smoke grenades and things they used to mark with. I mean, they were basically overloaded.
You had your issued weapon systems, and everybody modified the weapon systems to suit their own needs. And by the time we got done with ours, we carried 750 rounds. So you could just barely get it off the ground, but you know, you were able to go and get the job done.
Other helicopters, including the Chinook heavy lift helicopter, were tried out as gunships. They had plenty of lift for weapons, but they were too big and slow to really fill the need.
We called them guns a go-go. They worked in pairs, and they had 40 millimeter on the front. They had 20 millimeter. I think they had rockets. They had 50 calibers, I guess, out the sides and everything. But they were a lot of firepower.
As American involvement in the war went on and the need for armed helicopters was clearly established, the Cobra gunship was designed and fielded.
I'd seen movies of it in flight school, and I was smitten, if that's the word I could use. I wanted to fly Cobras. It was the sleekest thing I'd ever seen. It was a derivative from the Huey, the UH-1, same engine, the same transmission, different rotor head arrangement, but it was a very slim, trim bird. It was a tandem seater where one man sat in front, the other sat in the back, and it was designed strictly as a weapons platform.
Cobras worked out quite a bit around us, both while I was in the line company and with mortars. And they were kind of fun to watch. I mean, they dive really fast, not like the jets, of course, but when you watch a Cobra salvo rockets, it looks like the aircraft stops in the air. I'm sure, obviously, it's got to be an optical illusion. Pretty scary if you're close to them.
A Cobra helicopter usually traveled in a 100-killer team. And the Loach would go in, mark the spot. The gunship would go in and drop armament on it, rockets, miniguns, whatever they had. And we came upon two teams of the two Cobras, two Loaches, and they were hitting this target. We were watching them for probably 15 or 20 minutes, just throw stuff at this. I mean, just death and destruction on this. We didn't see anything, you know, it was just a spot.
In addition to their role in the hunter-killer team, gunships were used to prepare the LZ, or landing zone, for the troop carriers.
We'd have 4 gunships, 2 pairs, one on each side, and they would do a rotation, and it was designed so that the gunship that was on a firing run, shooting miniguns and rockets on our flank to keep the enemy's heads down. As soon as one pulled out, then the other one would be pulling in, and they would continuously keep the landing zone suppressed so that we could land and offload the troops and then get out.
When we were being inserted, the gunner on each side, the gunners would be firing into the tree lines, and you'd have some Cobras firing. Also, there were miniguns and rockets to keep us safe.
This responsive, effective support often made the difference for hard-pressed Allied forces. The ability to react quickly, no matter what the terrain, was vital. In response to this requirement, special units of helicopters were formed, known as air cavalry.
Each cav troop had the scout platoon, which was the Little Birds scouts. Up north, we had Hughes 500s, what they were called at the time, OH-6s. Had a gun platoon. We had AH-1G Cobras, and then a lift platoon, which was the UH-1H Hueys.
Also, each cav troop had their own platoon of infantry. Integration of the helicopters with a dedicated air-mobile cavalry element gave the Americans a huge advantage. If the ground force got into trouble, then the helicopters could quickly pull them out.
When it was hot, there was firepower available, phone call away. And if you needed out, you get the firepower and you could get extraction.
Where there were no LZs, the helicopters had to find a way of extracting the troops from the air.
If we were extracting a team, what we'd do is we'd come over the hole in the jungle, throw the ladder out, and then the recon team would climb up on the ladder, and then they had a D-ring that they'd use to hook into a rung of the ladder, and then we'd lift them up out of there and then go someplace that was secure and set down and let them off the ladder. The McGuire rig was a rope, and it was tied in the bottom of the aircraft, and it basically went down and had a strap in it, and the team member would sit in the strap and we would lift them out. And they had a couple of cases where they had people get wounded and fall out of them, and so they later changed to what's called the stabo rig, and it had the soldier on the ground had a harness that was part of his web gear, and the stabo rig would snap into that harness on his web gear, and it was a lot safer.
Eventually, America developed a fast way to create landing zones for helicopters. These were the daisy cutter bombs. A parachute stabilized these huge bombs as they dropped. Set to go off just above the ground, they blew down the trees and created a landing zone for Hueys to land troops. Air mobile operations became widespread throughout Vietnam as American forces sought to bring the enemy to battle. By the end of the war, virtually every American unit had participated in some way in air mobile operations. While no other division was as equipped with helicopters as the 1st Air Cavalry, helicopters could be assigned as needed from independent helicopter units. The first stage of an air mobile operation would be the detection of an enemy force by small light observation helicopters, or loaches. The idea then would be to suddenly surround the enemy using the mobility of helicopters before he could get away. If there were not already fire bases within range, GIs would quickly establish fire bases nearby the suspected enemy position. Then would come the artillerymen and the artillery itself. You can't move a 105mm howitzer in a Huey, but a CH-47 Chinook has no problem with it. Down would come artillery pieces, pallet loads of ammunition, sandbags to protect the position, and perhaps even a big sky crane would be enlisted to carry in particularly heavy equipment. When the fire bases were established, in would go the air assault. Heavily loaded grunts would line up at pickup points, waiting to be transported by Huey to LZs surrounding the enemy on several sides. First, the gunships would dive in, spraying the LZs with fire.
Yellow smoke, 200 meters, automatic weapons, over. This is 2-1, no sweat, got you covered. Okay, we'll stay trail. Joe, you got them? Request 9, you start your firing fast. Okay, we're starting firing fast now.
Then the Huey slicks would descend line after line, door gunners blasting the area around the landing zones. As soon as the slicks touched down, the troops took up positions along the tree lines.